My name is Samuel Tadros. I'm a distinguished visiting fellow here at the Hoover Institution, and I will be moderating today's panel. With its eminent scholars and world-renowned library and archives, the Hoover Institution seeks to improve the human condition by advancing ideas that promote economic opportunity and prosperity while securing and safeguarding peace for America and all mankind. Two ideas that are deeply linked. To say that Saudi Arabia and the Saudi-American alliance is at a moment of crisis is no exaggeration. The gruesome murder of Washington Post columnist Jamal Khashoggi at the Saudi Consulate in Istanbul has dominated headlines worldwide, resulted in unprecedented calls in Washington for the United States to punish its longtime ally. At the same time, Saudi Arabia is going through tremendous changes, some of which are positive, the women's lifting the ban on women to drive, for example, some of which have raised concerns in Washington, not the least of which is the Yemen war. Where is Saudi Arabia headed? What is the Saudi leadership led by Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman's vision? How stable is Saudi Arabia and MBS's rule? And how should the United States react to these changes and challenges? To help us understand this complex story, we are fortunate to be joined by three leading experts on Saudi Arabia and the U.S. Middle East policy. By order of speaking, Simon Henderson is the Baker Fellow and Director of the Bernstein Program on Gulf and Energy Policy at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, specializing in energy matters and the Arab Gulf states. A former journalist with the Financial Times, Mr. Henderson has also worked as a consultant advising corporations and governments on Gulf affairs. Dr. Karen Young is a resident scholar at the American Enterprise Institute, where she focuses on the political economy of the Middle East, the Gulf Cooperation Council, and the Arabian Peninsula. She teaches international relations and Middle East economy courses at both George Washington University, not so good, and at Johns Hopkins, great. Elliott Abrams is a senior fellow for Middle Eastern Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations. He served as Deputy Assistant to the President and Deputy National Security Advisor in the George W. Bush administration, where he supervised U.S. policy in the Middle East. He also served as Assistant Secretary of State in the Reagan administration and is the author of 5 books, most recently Realism and Democracy, American Foreign Policy After the Arab Spring, which I was fortunate to discuss with him here at Hoover maybe a year ago. As a matter of logistics, the panelists will each present opening remarks, followed by brief questions from the moderator, after which the floor will be open for questions. Thank you, everyone. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. It's very good to be here today, not only with you, but also with my friends and colleagues. So my name is Simon Henderson. My claim to fame is twofold. One is that I write about the Saudi royal family, and the other is that I've never been to Saudi Arabia. This is an important qualification. It begs the question, why have I never been to Saudi Arabia? And the answer is very simple. Many years ago, when I was a journalist, I wasn't prepared to go through some of the hoops constructed in order to get to Saudi Arabia. I then, wisely or foolishly, decided to write a report on Saudi succession. And this was not welcomed by the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. And so they've never given me a visa. In fact, I've written 2 reports on Saudi succession, which probably only deepens my predicament. The first one was called After King Fahd, Succession in Saudi Arabia. And this was in originally in 1994, but the second edition with this cover on it was in 1995. And the other report I wrote was on after King Abdullah's succession in Saudi Arabia, and that was written or published in 2009. There was, of course, at various points in the last few years, a hope and an intention that I would write a report after King Salman succession in Saudi Arabia, but things have moved so quickly that I've never got around to anything more than a brief sort of one-page chapter headings description of what it is. My wisdom for what it is on Saudi Arabia, or the House of Saud, is that it has been marked in historical terms by some tremendous upset and transitions. King Faisal was assassinated. King Saud, one of his predecessors, was pushed to one side because of essentially of incompetence. But the overall theme of this has been that the House of Saud, the Saudi royal family, has stuck together and reached decisions essentially by consensus, which means that their decision-making is cautious and often slow. We now have a situation whereby under King Salman and his hyperactive crown prince, Mohamed bin Salman, as we will often refer to him on this panel as just merely as MBS, his power, this is MBS's power, is not marked by consensus, nor is it marked by caution. And this is why we've got to where we are today and why we're sitting here today. The circumstances of being invited forces me to think on what parts of the studies that I've written about Saudi Arabia are relevant to today, and what parts of the framework of succession and how decisions are made and how we're going to move forward are relevant to today. And when you write something like this, you have a framework, and you can say the system does this, the system dictates that. But one of the expressions I've come up with in recent years, and this was, I think, even before King Salman became king, and I don't think I ever wrote it down, otherwise I'd actually quote it from the text to you, was that there isn't a system as such. They make it up as they go along. We are now in a position where they are making it up as they go along, and we don't really know what's going to happen. At least I don't think I know what's going to happen. But I look forward to your questions eventually to try and probe me on what might be important to look for and who might be important to watch over the next few weeks and months. Because I have some guesses. Whether they're good guesses, you'll be able to test and prove with events not so far into the future. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, thank you for the invitation to be here, and it's really a pleasure to be with Elliott Abrams and also Simon Henderson. I want to speak more about sort of the bilateral relationship between the United States and Saudi Arabia and some of the specific economic challenges that the kingdom is facing right now. And the premise of or the title of the panel today is Saudi Arabia in Crisis, but I think the crisis isn't necessarily such a domestic one in Saudi Arabia, but more about the nature of our relationship. And I think the recent media attention has really perhaps escalated or over-amplified the sense of that relationship. So I want to kind of give some cold hard facts of how we are connected. I do think there are some important similarities of what the kingdom is going through and what we are also experiencing here, the day after midterm elections in the United States. So domestic politics in Saudi Arabia right now are really going through a period of change. driven by demographic challenges, the obvious economic challenges, but also an attempt to redefine national identity. People have anxiety about jobs, about competition, and about their country's role in regional and international peace and security. That's kind of like us. But our approaches have been sort of different. So I've argued elsewhere that the United States, as many people argue, is withdrawing inward, while Saudi Arabia has made an attempt to engage outward. This includes some very aggressive foreign policy choices, the military intervention in Yemen, foreign policy aggression towards neighboring Qatar, but also in liberalization efforts in the economy, both as a destination for foreign investment and as a source of outwardly placed international capital, which is really Saudi Arabia's coming out party, has been the cash splurge of the Public Investment Fund and the real attempt to, I think, attract a domestic constituency in the kinds of investments that the PIF is making, very technology heavy, which are meant to appeal to a domestic constituency of young people. That's very much on purpose. As I said, I think the media attention recently has probably inflated the global economic position of Saudi Arabia. It is, of course, a very important economy, the largest economy of the Middle East. But it's a partner in the Middle East for the U.S. without a doubt, and we have some important economic ties, specifically in the Saudi government's investment in U.S. securities, both debt and equity securities. And the PIF has been an important investor in the technology sector here in the United States. But that's not the reason why we should treat this relationship still very carefully. I think the rationale for continued engagement and collaboration with Saudi Arabia, despite the hard time we're in right now, is about Saudi Arabia's regional political leadership role, of course, its impact in international energy markets, which is very, very important to our counter-Iran strategy. But more importantly, the ripple effects of Saudi Arabia in the larger MENA economy, and not just MENA, also South Asia, also Horn of Africa, right? So Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states are becoming important agents of development finance in the region, and that's something we should pay attention to. As far as U.S. corporate interest in Saudi Arabia are concerned, there's some obvious ones. There have been some very lucrative engagements for consultancies and investment banks over the past couple of years. In the banking sector and finance, it's mostly because Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states have been issuing tremendous amounts of sovereign debt. So $144 billion in the last 3 years. This amounts to about 25% of all emerging market debt issued from 2016 to the present. What that means is there's some very big fees being earned, but also that this is becoming a destination for international capital, and that it will be traded, and we will all kind of share in this ownership of Saudi Arabia's future, right? And there will be more debt issuance to come. There was a report that it was S&P issued today, an expectation of $300 billion of new debt from the Gulf over the next 3 years. So that's an important reason. But Saudi Arabia on its own doesn't have the ability to significantly alter the U.S. financial stability. Remittance flows, also very important. So when we think about downturn in Saudi Arabia, what that means in Pakistan or Egypt or Lebanon, places where many people depend on the Gulf and Saudi Arabia in particular to support their families at home. So this leads me to an evaluation more of the domestic economic agenda and Vision 2030, which is the Crown Prince's plan for diversification. It's really a development plan. And it included and has included a pretty significant reduction in subsidies of electricity, water, gasoline, efforts to create alternative sources of government revenue, so fee structures, especially on expatriates, the implementation of a value-added tax, which has been an important source of new revenue, and these efforts to attract foreign investment. And that's where things are not going so well. So there is a real problem right now of capital flight from the kingdom. Investors are certainly wary with good reason. The Public Investment Fund, the Sovereign Wealth Fund, I think is somewhat like a parallel state in Saudi Arabia right now. It has tremendous responsibility, not just for placing the kingdom's wealth abroad to grow, but also as a source of domestic development. And this is very different than the role that sovereign wealth funds have traditionally played in the Gulf. The domestic economic agenda introduces, or I think is trying to address some real core vulnerabilities in Saudi Arabia. And this is mostly about the labor market. The labor market has been divided or bifurcated between nationals and non-nationals. The demographics of the country, of course, a very young population. People need jobs, and they need jobs in the private sector, and that's a hard thing to do. And it's not just about work, it's really about inclusion. It's about a feeling, and this is the grievances that motivated the uprisings in 2011. It's about a feeling of that your life can move forward, that you can achieve these milestones of starting a family, buying a house in the reverse order, of really seeing progress. And that's a grievance that many young people have. The problem is, right now, the government is very much still reliant on oil revenues. This has not changed. It's been very difficult to kind of jumpstart a private sector, and the scares after the Ritz-Carlton purge in 2017, November, and most recently the Khashoggi murder, are only making that attraction of outside investment all the more difficult. So I'm really interested in the 10 million Saudi citizens who are 30 or under. This is the Crown Prince's generation. This is his constituency. And I'm concerned about them because they could potentially be a lost generation. If we think, now we know what their challenges are, but if we think 20, 25 years from now about this generation, if they don't find work, if the government can't employ them, the healthcare sector in Saudi Arabia is changing dramatically right now. This will be a public health burden. Many of these people, as projections expect, will not be in good health, will have diabetes, will be a burden, and the declining birth rates, the emancipation, liberation of women, which is a thing to celebrate, is also meaning that the next generation, who in most societies would be the ones to generate wealth to pay for the care of retired people, will not be as big, right? So we will see a much smaller Saudi citizen population in the next generation, and they will be responsible for taking care of this youth bulge right now when these people are older, and that's a huge fiscal challenge. Can I keep going a little bit? Yeah? So what we've seen in the last week is a sort of right-sizing of the National Transformation Plan, which is sort of the short-term plan of Vision 2030. And this right-sizing has basically been a cut in half of many of the targets which were meant to be achieved by 2020. And most notably, of course, in the target for women's labor force participation has been cut down now to 25% of women, Saudi women, as actively in the labor force. The original goal was 30%, that it was 28, now it's 25. So what the government is basically acknowledging is a problem of human capital and kind of overstretch in Vision 2030. It's very hard to achieve these objectives. And that's not to say that they are failing, it's just to say that it's going to take a lot more effort and it's going to be expensive. And there are women in Saudi Arabia very eager to work. That's not the problem. Every time there's an opening for new jobs in the public sector or in private sector, women flock to the opportunity more than men. And in fact, we're seeing growth more among Saudi women in the labor force than in men. All the same, there are only about 20% of Saudi women in the labor force. So this is a problem because going forward, demographically, next generation, the economy will really require dual income families. And so we're not there. Why do people want public sector jobs? Because they pay about 50% more. Why is it hard to get Saudis to work in the private sector? Because of this problem of imported labor, which has been very, very cheap. So Saudiization, the Nitikah programs are now requiring businesses to hire Saudis. This passes on the burden to local businesses, which many are deciding to shut down or not to hire as many people. So the business environment is definitely under some stress. Luckily, higher oil prices over the past year have masked some of this difficulty. So the government had a bonus of about $23 billion in unexpected or increased oil revenues this year. 70% of fiscal revenue is based on oil revenues, right? So the government is still very, very much dependent on that. So what are they doing with the extra money? Almost all of it went to public sector wage bill and social benefits. There was also an increase in military spending. So these are things that, should oil prices decline again, are not sustainable. And the government at the same time continues to borrow to finance its deficit, which has been declining. But the savings generated from this short period now of ascending oil prices again have not been used necessarily to create opportunity and to shift away from especially public sector wage bill, so spending on paying people to work for the state. Where else is money going? To feed the PIF, right? So the PIF is becoming this parallel state, this entity on its own with tremendous power, but also taking tremendous risk. So a lot of the investments that the Sovereign Wealth Fund is making are in, like most recently, in a robot that makes pizzas, okay? Which is a great company. It's a Silicon Valley kind of company. But if this is the national nest egg, right? This is society's wealth. Where would you want it placed? So that's just kind of an open-ended question. So the foreign policy objective, the aggression towards neighbors, are we seeing some sign of maybe a scale back? Perhaps, but it doesn't look like there's, as Simon mentioned, a real shift in a return to consensus building in domestic politics, or the things that would perhaps create a more a friendly environment to outside investment. So those are some of the challenges that I see going forward for the kingdom. And it doesn't mean that all is lost, but it means that essentially the old model of being very heavily reliant on oil revenues for growth and for spending has not really changed. And so some kind of economic transformation does have to happen, and no one expects it to be overnight, but it is somewhat now, I think, stymied.
Thank you. Thanks very much. I'm very pleased to be here with all of you. Let me just go back for a minute and say why these changes that we're all interested in. I think by, say, 2015, the death of King Abdullah, it was apparent to a lot of people, including King Salman and his son, Mohamed, that the system wasn't working. The system of going from brother to brother to brother, they were dying off, they were all in their 80s, that had to change. Oil dependence, that had to change. The sort of non-productive economy, nobody worked. Women were not permitted to work. That had to change. So the education system, which was not producing people who were capable of taking the jobs that the 21st century produced. So when King Salman became king, he began to change that. For example, it looks as if the brother to brother, there's a fancy Latin word for this, but I don't remember what it is. But that system's over, right? You now have one royal family. It's the bin Salman family. Thus, the king's son is crown prince, and we assume that it will go in this line of succession. Saudi 2030, whether it works or not, huge question, but the goals are, I think we could say, the right goals. Change in the status of women, in part, I think, is because they realized, or MBS realized, that Saudi women work. They wish to work, and they do work, and they have a work ethic, which is greater than that of Saudi men, generalizing. And I should add, he has also kind of let the clergy know what they can do and what they cannot do. So you have social and economic reform goals, but you have no political reform. Political reform did not take place, will not take place. It is not part of the program. And Mohammed bin Salman would defend that by saying, look, the social and economic change is going to be extremely difficult, and it will be resisted. It'll be resisted by people in the clergy. It'll be resisted by people who have an economic stake in the old order. It will be resisted by people in the royal family. I think one of the reasons for the Ritz-Carlton shakedown was to say, you know, those days are coming to an end. And it was also about crushing dissent. The arrests of women protesting for the right to drive shortly before the right to drive was given were made, I think, the arrests were made to deliver a message, which was, I decide the pace of change. I decide the pace of change. You don't decide the pace of change. There are a couple of problems with all of this. The first I would call repression. The system has tightened up. It was never a very open system, but it's worse now. And there are a number of cases of this. There was a famous one a few years ago, someone who's still in prison, Raif Badawi, the blogger, was sentenced to 1,000 lashes. He's still in prison. He was given 50 lashes, I think, and then there was enough of a protest to stop it. Part of the problem with this kind of arrests of someone like him or those women protesters is they're a natural constituency for the Crown Prince in many ways. If he is a reformer and he wants to get support, these are people who also want change in Saudi society and who might be allies, but not if they're in prison. And this kind of action offends people in the West and makes the whole reform project seem at least partly fake. And I'd also say, and I'll come to this again in a second, if you have no freedom of expression and you have no freedom of criticism of the government, you have no feedback loops. I mean, one of the advantages of a free press is to say, that minister is a thief. And you may not know that minister is a thief. You may not know that the governor of such and such a province is actually doing a very poor job and is highly unpopular because that governor, who is your cousin after all, is not going to tell you. So first, repression has gone beyond, how can I put this without being misquoted? It's gone beyond the kind of repression that you might think would be useful for Mohammed bin Salman's reform project. Secondly, there's a sense that there's no government. There's just the Crown Prince. You know, he is Deputy Prime Minister, he's Crown Prince, he's Minister of Defense, he's head of the Economic and Social Council, he's head of the Political Military Council. It's kind of a...
And Aramco.
Head of Aramco. Now, that's, you know, impossible for any one person to do, no matter how talented. And it also means that too much is done by, let's call it whim. There's no system. In any system where there are rules, there might be such a thing as law and justice. When there's one-man rule, there is too great a danger that, I didn't use the word democracy, I used law and justice. There's too great a likelihood that those don't exist in the eyes of most Saudis. Mistakes, as the saying goes, mistakes are made, in the passive way of putting it. For example, the row with Canada seems to me clearly from the Saudi point of view a mistake. The killing of Khashoggi seems to me from the Saudi point of view clearly a mistake. It is possible to have a monarchy and a government. I mean, just two examples. The United Arab Emirates is ruled by a group of brothers, in Abu Dhabi, basically running the federal government as well. And then there are the emirs of each individual emirate. So you've got two kind of checks on one-man rule. One is you've got a bunch of full brothers who are able to say to one to another, that's a really dumb idea. That is a stupid idea. Don't do it. That's dangerous. And you have these other emirs who can say, hold on a minute, hold on a minute. I don't really want that done in my emirate. But you don't have that in the Saudi system. In other monarchies, Jordan, Morocco, Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar, there's such a thing as a prime minister. Saudis don't, I mean, they have the title. The king is always prime minister, and the crown prince always has the title deputy prime minister, but it's not real. In these other cases, it is real. There is an actual prime minister who's at least the administrative head of the government. So give me a couple more minutes to say, so what should we be doing? We, the United States, how do we react to this current situation? I'm struck by one slightly similar situation. One can take this too far, but there was a crisis in American-Chinese relations after Tiananmen Square, after the massacre. And there was a very interesting letter from Richard Nixon in 1990. Now, the massacre is 1989. Nixon's, of course, a long time out of power. And he writes a private letter to Deng Xiaoping. And I'll just read you a few sentences. I profoundly believe the PRC-US relationship has been of great benefit to both of our countries strategically. It's a 5-page letter, but how can we repair the differences which have arisen between us in recent months? The differences have arisen because they slaughtered people in Tiananmen Square. Certainly not by toasts of eternal friendship, which ignore those differences. And certainly not by negotiations designed to end those differences. The only way to build a new firm relationship is to recognize we have some irreconcilable differences, but we have common interests which are infinitely more important. We must first recognize that the events of June 4th had a tragic impact on our relationship. Then he talks about President Bush, George H.W. Bush. What's particularly important for you to recognize is that he has taken terrible political heat from both Republicans as well as Democrats in Congress for not taking what they believe should be a harder line toward the PRC. It's an interesting parallel here. What further steps could you take to mitigate this situation? He's not asking for the United States to take any steps. You, Deng Xiaoping. And one of them, he says, is amnesty for those who demonstrated peacefully, which is interesting. Looking to the future, Nixon writes, what is most important is that the economic reforms which made you one of the world's most admired leaders get back on track. To put the situation in a nutshell, China enjoyed enormous economic progress through a policy of economic reforms without political reforms. It is imperative that steps be taken now to return China to its rightful place as a civilized member of the world community. It would be a tragedy if China continues to be seen as a repressive throwback to a dark age of the past. Let me be quite candid. I am not suggesting that China move away from Leninism and become a multi-party democracy. Well, there's a lot that's very interesting here. I think we ought to be saying to the Saudis, you have done something terrible and you need to take some steps to fix it. Steps like end this ludicrous fight with Canada. End the ludicrous fight with Qatar. It's time. And both of those would be, both symbolically and in real terms, significant changes. Then there are people like Raif Badawi and others who should be coming out of prison. We may be delivering that message. It's striking to me here at Nixon, who probably more than any other American, including the President of the United States then, would get a serious hearing. There are such people in the U.S. I think of previous CENTCOM commanders. One or two have great reputations in Saudi Arabia. George H.W. Bush is probably too old at this point. George W. Bush, James Baker. I mean, there are people who one can think of who they might take quite seriously. And a final point, I know this will seem like perhaps an outlandish suggestion, but one might think we could send an ambassador to Saudi Arabia one of these days.
Well, that's quite the suggestion you're asking from the administration. The death was hardly mentioned. I mean, Dr. Young mentioned it in a sentence, you did. That was not the reaction if you watched US media. It got wall-to-wall coverage, the kind of which is usually only for American affairs. Do you see that this issue has subsided now? If we had this panel 2 weeks ago, would we be talking much more about the death of Khashoggi and what it meant and its impact?
Well, I'll go first. Yeah, I mean, you know, we all watched the election returns yesterday, and one of the things that people were discussing was what was the impact of the Kavanaugh hearings? And the impact, whatever it was, would have been greater had the Kavanaugh hearings ended last Friday. So time passes, and we've had, for example, an election. The build-up to an election. So the amount of attention being dedicated in Washington has fallen. I think, you know, it was a very shocking event in many ways. It was, I'll use the word I was going to use, it was unbelievably stupid. And it was shocking. And it was ruthless, but the ruthlessness, I think, was not as shocking because many, many governments around the world do things that are ruthless. Democracies do things that are ruthless at times. But it was the combination of that with the sort of foolishness. And it raised the question that you know, I tried to raise, that is, wasn't there anybody in the entire system who knew about this? I mean, 10,000 people didn't know about it, but who was in a position to say, gee, that's a terrible idea, don't do it? And if the answer is no, and it apparently is no, then that tells you something's deeply wrong with the system.
You used the word reformer. He himself, MBS, has come out and said, I'm not a reformer. I never called myself this. I'm referring to the Bloomberg interview. So what is he? A guy who wanted to rule Saudi Arabia and just did the necessary steps to create a favorable impression?
The term I would use is enlightened despot. You go back to Catherine the Great, Frederick the Great. No nonsense about democracy. One man or one woman rule, Catherine the Great. But if he goes through with all this, wouldn't you call him a reformer? No?
I'm sure.
How does he merit the adjective enlightened?
Well, if he goes through with restricting the role of the Wahhabi clergy and significantly increasing the role of women, he'll be, he would win it, no?
There was a period in history in Europe called the Enlightenment, and that's the natural comparison that I have. So, I'm not sure whether it matches up to it, but I'll try and think during either the course of today or in the following weeks what's a good word, in which case I'll be in touch with you.
Could I say, I think we've put a lot of attention into the Crown Prince, but really the person who is making institutional changes in Saudi Arabia is King Salman, because he's the one who has enabled, the removal of 2 crown princes, the rise of his son, and he still has the power to change that. I don't think that's likely, but he's, the king is still in charge. And I think a lot of the shifts in what we see as, traditional consensus building, those changes were made by King Salman. So he's currently on a what we would call in the United States, like what did Hillary Clinton's first tour to New York, what was it called? When you're doing like a listening tour.
Yeah.
Yeah, King Salman is on a listening tour right now, and across the provinces of Saudi Arabia. And I think that is a very, very good thing. The Crown Prince is with him. And I think what they learn, as you mentioned this, lack of feedback. What they learn right now will be very, very important, and more important is if they listen, right?
And if anybody has the guts to speak.
And if anyone has the guts to speak, absolutely, yeah.
King Salman has allowed all those changes, and in a sense, we're all worried about the stability of Saudi Arabia. Some of these changes seem to be undermining that very stability. Meaning, if you want a stable Saudi Arabia, you might think of a return to the past, the cautious, the consensus building. You've removed two crown princes, removed them while the whole basis of your political system is not people's vote, but an oath of allegiance that they give to these crown princes and kings. You've sidelined completely significant portions, if not all of the other branches of the royal family. Aren't you playing a very dangerous game, you being MBS in this sense? Shouldn't we, if we're really worried about Saudi Arabia's stability, talk to him about the need for consensus building?
Well, it's an interesting question. I don't think he's a natural listener. And the extent to which he listens, he may listen, but I don't think he changes his view. And trying to understand his view is a work in progress. The trouble with this Khashoggi murder is there is this continuing element of doubt whether perhaps he didn't know about it. That's very much a perhaps, and we're waiting on the next dribble of information to come out of President Erdogan of Turkey, and there may be several dribbles to come out. So there might become clarity on that. But he has, I think there is doubt. You can raise questions whether Vision 2030 is a well thought out initiative or merely a phrase he picked up from a group of management consultants who gave him a report. I think we also have to consider whether his notion of a reversion to moderate Islam is really intended, or it's just a device to persuade us that he's the guy to go with. And the intriguing part, or for many of us, is that behind closed doors, and some of the doors weren't that closed or have been opened since, he has, especially when he was here earlier in the year, he spoke of a vision of the Middle East, whereby the Palestinian issue was a challenge but not an obstacle. And he saw Israel as a natural partner for Saudi Arabia in the future in terms of both commerce and technology. And was he sincere with that? Again, I don't know, but I'm forced to re-ask the question now and reopen consideration of the question. And sort of to close the point, which may or may not be a tangent, is that it forces us in the United States to consider what is the proper, what is our relationship with Saudi Arabia. And you talked about China. I don't think it's the same as China. China is a competitor, a challenger. It's not an ally. Notionally, Saudi Arabia has been a friend and ally. It's been sometimes a little less friendly than we'd like and a little less dependable than we would like to expect of allies. But basically, it's been on our side. But challenges like this force us to, just in terms of public opinion, we clearly can't consider it as it's not Canada or it's not Britain. You know, whatever the special relationship with Saudi Arabia is, it shouldn't be confused with other relationships. And I think the core of the relationship, and the one which we'll have to use to see us through, is a recognition, an unfortunate recognition that the relationship is based on oil. And we have to stay friendly with Saudi Arabia because of that, because of it's the world's largest oil exporter, and therefore a significant contributor to the stability of the world economy. And this is going to be the way it is for the many years forward. We can argue about the date when it may change, but it's irrelevant for the purposes of today's conversation. And so we have to recover the relationship and push it forward, but it's only because we need Saudi Arabia as a partner in the stability of the world economy.
One last question. Dr. Young, you mentioned the words national identity. Saudi Arabia is perhaps the least natural state there is. The Arabian Peninsula was unified only once under Prophet Mohamed. It has never been ruled in that configuration since. The whole country is called, after all, after the name of a family. There's little that unites people in the Hejaz to those of Najd. Historically, each region was completely separate with different rulers. But the crown prince's moves, even the foolish ones in our eyes, like the row with Canada, for example, help build the idea of Saudi pride, that Saudi Arabia means something. How do you see that moving forward? Can you build a national identity in Saudi Arabia, or are the challenges simply too big?
I would take some issue with the premise of your question. I mean, I think there are plenty of places that develop national identities that don't have a long shared history, and certainly the United States, and part of my family is Cherokee Native American, right? So, I mean, we would take issue with that too. But anyway, there is a strong sense of national identity and nationalism in Saudi Arabia. Really, it's been supported by all of the GCC states right now are working on this, right? For different reasons. And in Saudi Arabia, this is, it's generational. It's because people want to feel that they stand for something and that they have an identity that can be presented on the world stage and to be seen as equals. That's really, really important to people. It's also because of foreign policy choices and the war in Yemen. In the United Arab Emirates, this has been a big cause of increase in a sense of national identity, and I think in Saudi Arabia as well. And it's useful to governments, right? I mean, this is why all governments invest in this kind of thing. It's a useful mode of putting down some dissent, of papering over cleavages of sectarian identity, of regional identities, and all governments do this. So yes, it's happening in Saudi Arabia, and I think it's real and it's important to people, especially to young people. And one thing I've been on a a number of these kind of panels lately after the Khashoggi murder. And one thing I think is really important is it's not so much for us as outsiders to decide and judge Saudi Arabia's form of government or who's in charge, but Saudis themselves. And I do think this is linked to a sense of rising nationalism, is that Saudis have a great deal of pride, but they also feel, and people I've spoken to personally, feel very wounded and insulted by the murder of Khashoggi, and that they want justice and they want someone held responsible because it's an insult to what they see as a code of norms of their society. And I've heard this from people who are former, ministers to young people to, all different parts of society.
Well, the floor is now open for questions. Please identify yourself before asking the question.
Hi, Abe Shulsky from Hudson Institute. Thank you for this discussion. It's been fascinating. I'd like to raise one issue that's sort of only come up tangentially, which is the religious situation and the degree of clerical resistance to MBS. I mean, if you would have described what's going on in Saudi Arabia now, say 5 years ago, you would have thought, okay, well, this is really risky because the country, as we've always said, rested on this alliance between the Sauds and the Wahhabis, and now it seems like one side is kind of unilaterally breaking the deal. And you haven't seen a lot of that resistance in the open, but I'm just wondering, is that underneath, is that a fault line that could come up at some point? Much smaller things like introducing television led to the assassination of King Faisal, and now the whole notion that the place of women will be changed in society would seem like a much bigger deal than introducing television, and yet you haven't seen, at least I haven't, just looking at it superficially, haven't seen the kind of resistance that one would have expected.
If I may, I think it's a very interesting question, and certainly one of the things to be looking for in Saudi Arabia at the moment. My own view is that the so-called coalition between the House of Saud and the clerics has been changing over time, and the clerics have been a junior partner for some time, and they are perhaps even more of a junior partner. My working assumption is they are probably not that happy about what has been going on in terms of social transformation, because it undermines their position even more. But I don't see that they've accepted it as much as they're waiting to see, to see what's an appropriate time to play their hand. And the phrase I normally use, but these days almost all your phrases on Saudi Arabia seem inappropriate, was they were probably going to give MBS enough rope to hang himself with. And certainly to the point where that he would make a mistake and he would need to come to them to help him dig himself out of the mistake. I don't think he's made that mistake yet, but I think they're all hanging around to see when that opportunity is going to arise. If I can make one additional point, not so much on the clerics, but as you may have seen, that the king has started a week-long tour of the kingdom to feel the pulse of the nation or whatever. It'll be interesting to see, and I will be monitoring to see which places he's going to, because this will be his definition and a Saudi definition of which are the provinces. He can't go to every one of them in 7 days or 8 days, but the ones he chooses will have a reason. The reason is guessable or knowable, and that's what I'm looking for.
I would just add the declining role of the clergy precedes MBS. For example, it was at least under King Abdullah, that the religious police, the Mutawayin, began to have their powers taken away. And that was very popular. No one wants to, no one. Very few people want to go into a shopping mall and get, hit with a stick or see their spouse hit with a stick. One is told that many of these reforms, Simon doesn't like me to use the word changes, okay, are popular, particularly generationally. That is, they are popular with Saudis under 30. That's a lot of Saudis. And so one assumes that clergy who are unhappy, would be trying to weigh, well, how does the populace feel? There's not much point in our complaining if 90% of the people are against us. And then there's, I think it was clear a year ago that that open dissent would not be tolerated.
Hi, I'm Jim Timby. I'm from Hoover, California. Can someone on the panel address the question of the use of social media in Saudi Arabia, both by the citizens and by the authorities? I mean, is it like the United States, everybody on the internet, everybody on Facebook? Is it like China, where the authorities use it for repression, but also to gather feedback? Just, if someone could address that question.
Yeah, I mean, I can a little bit. It's obviously enormously important across the developing world right now of access to technology. And Saudis are no exception. People are incredibly well connected. Everybody has 2 phones, et cetera. But the government's use of social media and of monitoring citizens' use and people outside who are critical of the government has been extreme. And of course, the sidelining of Saud Qahtani, the Crown Prince's kind of right-hand man, who was really kind of the information czar as well, is interesting because there was a very concerted effort to monitor traffic and to also to promote, so both in positive and negative kind of feedback loops of people's opinions. The Saudi government, I will say, has been doing a good amount of public opinion surveys. So this is not data that's available to us as Americans or researchers necessarily, but it has been going on for the last 3 years. And both external consultancies, including Cambridge Analytica, as well as the government creating its own bodies to do this work. And so they are very attuned to especially what young people think, what they say in focus groups, but also the way that they share information online, which is good and bad. Of some very prominent Saudi activists living outside of the kingdom. One woman in particular decided recently to deactivate her Twitter account while giving a public address because she felt like it was making her more of a target and her followers more of a target than she was doing good. So this is certainly something that's part of what it means to be an activist right now in Saudi Arabia and what it means to try to have a voice. It's a very difficult environment.
If I could make a point there as well. I mean, social media is fascinating in technological terms. And things have been changing so much over the last 20 or 30 decades. The advent of satellite television, which essentially meant that you could pick up news from another country other than your own, has had a tremendous effect across the Middle East. In the old days, the newspapers were either government-owned or effectively government-owned, so they gave you the information the government wanted you to have. There was only a state radio and there was only a state television. All that has broken down. They can get, people can get views and news, good or bad, true or false, from a range of sources. In Saudi Arabia at the moment, the government manipulates social media, but it's the nature of social media, it's that government control of it and its manipulation is imperfect. And just as an example, over the last 2 or 3 days, I've been getting sent, because my familiarity with social media is not as great as my children. But I am therefore sent by friends and acquaintances pictures, photos of taken by princes of other princes, and which is an indication that things are going on. I mean, I've had 3 in the last 2 days, I think. One was of Khalid bin Talal, who's been under arrested. He's been under arrest. He's actually, he hasn't been freed as far as I can make out. He's on sort of day release, mainly because his father is very ill in hospital and he's being allowed to go and see his father. But to see that picture or that photograph on my iPhone is extraordinarily interesting. Another picture is of Prince Ahmed, the brother of the king, who returned from London recently, in hospital, holding the hand of Prince Talal, who's lying in bed. And another picture was of Abdulaziz bin Fahad, son of the former king, who was, I don't think he's been released. He seems to be allowed to have visitors under his palace arrest. And this was of a couple of him and his young daughter and some other prince sitting there. And I can't imagine for one moment, this is why it's fascinating, I can't imagine for one moment that MBS is allowing this to happen deliberately to show the freedom of association within the royal family. The royal family is demonstrating that they are alive and kicking. Whether they're up to some sort of coup, counter-coup, whatever you would like to call it, is quite another question. But social media is producing information and delivering content which make the kingdom so fascinating for me to look at these days.
Thank you all for being here today. It's very informative. I'm not a Saudi Arabia watcher, but I'm learning a lot today. I'm Tracy Rue. I'm with RAND, and I focus mostly on security cooperation. And as you were talking, I kept waiting to hear on something about U.S. arms sales to Saudi Arabia, and where has that leverage or the way that works in our relationship, has that changed within the last month with all that's come up lately with watching Saudi Arabia more closely in the last month? And just any comments you have on that relationship compared to, as you said, how important the oil is in the world's relationship. How would you categorize U.S. arms sales to Saudi Arabia?
Well, this was an immediate object of controversy after the Khashoggi killing because it had been before due to Yemen. And there's been a lot of suggestions in Congress that the United States stop selling arms to Saudi Arabia. I think that would be a big mistake because, pardon me, we don't have a security relationship with King Salman and Mohamed bin Salman. We have a security relationship with Saudi Arabia. And we and the Saudis have some of the same enemies, starting with Iran. Moreover, if the Saudis want these arms, and we don't sell them, they'll get them someplace else, so I'm not quite sure what we're accomplishing, except undermining the very long-term security relationship. And then one has to get into the question of, well, what arms? I think you would never pass in Congress, the President would veto it anyway, but you'd never pass an absolute cutoff of arms sales to Saudi Arabia. But what about this arms system or that arms system? Some of the arms systems are defensive. For example, the anti-missile systems, Patriots, that sort of thing. What has, I think, more of a chance of being approved in Congress is an effort to stop the refueling of Saudi aircraft that are bombing Yemen, because they've had a poor record in Yemen, a poor record of accuracy, and there are too many civilians who've been hit, and it has not really, for whatever reason, I don't really know the reason, it hasn't gotten better. You know, you would think that over, let's say, a 2-year period, the targeting would be improved. It hasn't been. So I think that'll be more controversial. But, and particularly now, with the Armed Services Committee in the House in the hands of Democrats, one would assume that they could hold some hearings and try to make a bigger public issue out of this. But, you know, you're going to find some Democratic senators and congressmen and congresswomen who are in districts where there are jobs connected to those sales, and they will not go along.
If I could make a point there, I think it's tempting for the United States to think that arms sales is what I would call a lever, but you would call a lever. Isn't that what you do?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, fine. I've got a US passport, but being an American is a work in progress. Okay? We, the United States, think we can use arms sales as a device to tweak, to recalibrate the relationship. And we can, there's the bit which the administration can control, and then there's the bit which Congress thinks it can control as well. So it's an awkward device to use. The more interesting question for me is how Saudi Arabia, or in this case MBS, would respond to that. And my guess would be that he would respond badly to that. Badly might mean he would cancel a deal or something, or buy S-400s from Russia, something like that. Or, as was indicated by a Saudi journalist writing a piece about 3 weeks ago, when he said, do you want to see $100 oil, $200 oil, double that? This was, to my mind, a signal from MBS that, you know, if you want to play rough, you haven't seen rough yet, and which goes back to the main point that I was making, is that the basis of the need for us to have a continuing relationship with Saudi Arabia is oil. And if they start playing around with production, which will therefore push prices up, we have a real problem.
There was that article, but the energy minister, Khalid Fallah, has been very adamant that oil will not be weaponized. And I think if there is an adult in the room, he's certainly one of them. In terms of the refueling needs, I think Secretary Mattis said recently that only 25% of the refueling that goes on over Yemen is done by the United States. So we don't have that much leverage on that issue, actually. But you're also correct that there hasn't been necessarily much of an improvement in targeting with U.S. security cooperation. To Simon's point on, you know, the nature of the cooperation and the relationship between Saudi Arabia and the United States, oil is obviously important, but it's not just oil. We're connected in many, many other ways. And, you know, it depends on the way that you look at regional economies and look at the way that growth in our global economy is happening now and the way it's going to happen in the next 10, 20 years. And it's eastward, right? So, I mean, where growth will be. There's a wonderful cover of Bloomberg's Business Week this week, and it shows a depiction of a map of where growth is happening, and India is, inflated. China is inflated, because that's where the world is going, and that's why the Middle East matters, and that's why Saudi Arabia matters, because they are oriented in their trade eastward, in energy products, but not just oil, in refined products, petrochemicals, right? The development of ports, of their ability to invest in all kinds of international securities in the United States and elsewhere, and the geographies, the points of, or choke points in world trade are areas on both sides of Saudi Arabia, the Strait of Hormuz and the Bab el-Mandeb. And so our interest in securing those areas is about energy, but it's also about petrochemicals, it's about fertilizers, it's about rice, it's about soybeans. So in terms of global food security and all the things that everybody needs, and the places where most people live and most people who are coming up into the middle class, that's why we should care about Saudi Arabia.
Well, this concludes our panel today. Please join me in thanking our panelists.